In barely 3 months in the fall of 1823, the small Pennsylvanian village of Millbrook reported 17 mysterious fatalities. The fact that the same family-owned funeral company had arranged each victim's burial was what was most unsettling about these deaths, not the sheer number of them. Serving the neighborhood for more than 20 years, the Hartwell Funeral Parlor had established a solid reputation for providing careful care for the departed and showing empathy to bereaved families. However, a traveling doctor discovered evidence that would rock the foundations of this sleepy Pennsylvania hamlet when he saw strange scars on many bodies during a routine health inspection. The records found in the Hartwell establishment's basement were so horrific that local authorities hid them for almost a century. Others claim that the whole truth has never been revealed. If you enjoy spooky historical mysteries like this one, please hit the notification bell and subscribe to our channel before we continue with the Hartwell family and their mansion of horrors. The most terrifying real-life tales from America's past are presented here. Additionally, please specify which state or city you are listening from in the comments section. We like hearing from our global mystery-loving community. But allow me to transport you back to the rural Pennsylvania in 1823, where the Hartwell family had established what seemed to be a respectable company on a foundation of unspeakable evil. Millbrook, a town of only 300 people who lived off of farming, logging, and the occasional visitor who stopped at the town's one inn, was tucked away in the undulating hills of southeast Pennsylvania. For the fledgling American Republic, 1823 was a time of expansion. Small villages like Millbrook, however, continued to be mainly cut off from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, two thriving centers. Neighbors in this neighborhood were familiar with one another. The neighborhood was held together by trust, and children played freely in the streets. When patriarch Ezekiel Hartwell bought a big stone home on the outskirts of Millbrook and opened the first funeral business in the area in 1801, the Hartwell family had already moved to the town. Families had either made their own coffins or depended on the local carpenter to do so prior to the Hartwells. Some residents of the town were first suspicious of Ezekiel's professional approach to death care, but they soon warmed up to him because of his courteous demeanor and reasonable costs. Along with his wife Martha, their 3 children, Rebecca, Josiah, and Caleb, as well as Martha's aging father, Thomas Creed, Ezekiel resided in the funeral parlor. The family seemed to exemplify the rural Pennsylvania Protestant work ethic. They engaged in neighborhood barn raisings, went to Methodist church on Sundays, and Martha was well known for delivering pies to low-income households. At the age of 26, Josiah was the eldest son and was supposed to inherit the business after learning the craft from his father. 3-year-old Caleb helped with grave digging and construction. Rebecca, only 19, assisted her mother with household chores and frequently consoled bereaved families with her kind demeanor. The preparation rooms were located in a wooden addition to the 3-story stone building that housed the Hartwell Company. The family's living quarters and the place where departed loved ones were viewed were both located on the main floor. The family's bedrooms were on the 2nd level, accessible by a narrow staircase, and a basement that had been transformed into the embalming and storage space was reached by another flight of stairs. For individuals who couldn't afford to be buried elsewhere, the property also had a modest cemetery site and a big barn where coffins were built. The Hartwells' willingness to help families regardless of their financial situation was what made them especially dependable in the neighborhood. When harvests failed during hard winters, they frequently offered services in return for food or future work. As a result of their kindness, a network of appreciative families was established throughout the area, and news of their kind assistance reached nearby communities. Nearly every death within a 15-mile radius was being handled by the Hartwell Funeral Parlor by 1823. Tensions between traditional rural values and the increasing influence of industrial modernization characterized the political climate of Pennsylvania in 1823. In New York, the Erie Canal was almost finished, offering the area previously unheard-of economic potential while simultaneously posing a threat to the established order of small-town life. As conventional power systems were questioned, religious revival movements swept through Pennsylvania villages, bringing with them social unrest as well as spiritual regeneration. Organizations like the Hartwell Funeral Parlor, stood for continuity and stability in an environment of upheaval and uncertainty. But underneath this respectability, a darker element was establishing itself in the Hartwell home. Opportunities that most people could never have imagined were made possible by the nature of their job, the seclusion of their work, and the faith that bereaved families placed in them. Death had become their preoccupation, as well as their means of subsistence, and anyone who learned the truth would be appalled by the impending crossing of the boundaries between making and caring for the dead. When Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived in Millbrook on the 15th of October 1823 to perform his yearly health examination of the nearby townships, it was the first indication that something was wrong. Dr. Harrison was a state-employed traveling doctor who kept an eye out for disease outbreaks and made sure that rural villages were maintaining appropriate hygienic standards. His visits were routine, usually consisting of inspections of food storage facilities, burial customs, and water sources. Dr. Harrison was originally drawn to the peculiar conditions he saw during his required inspection of the Hartwell funeral parlor, rather than the quantity of recent fatalities in Millbrook. Following multiple cholera outbreaks in the previous 10 years, Pennsylvania law mandated that all bodies be available for medical examination upon request from a state physician. On that clear fall morning, Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah welcomed Dr. Harrison to the Hartwell establishment. The two guys showed him around their facilities, showing off their state-of-the-art embalming apparatus and immaculately sanitized preparation areas. Before Dr. Harrison asked to inspect 3 remains that were in their custody in preparation for funeral services later that week, everything seemed to be in order. Elianena Fairchild, a 8-year-old widow, was the owner of the first body. She had reportedly died 3 days prior from consumption. During his examination, Dr. Harrison observed something that chilled him to the bone. Beneath the high collar of Elianena's burial robe, small but distinct bruise marks were apparent along her neck. Instead of the wasting sickness that had allegedly taken her life, the pattern was compatible with manual strangulation. Josiah Hartwell promptly clarified that they had placed Eleanor incorrectly during the embalming procedure, resulting in post-mortem bruising. When Dr. Harrison questioned the marks, Dr. Harrison decided to take a closer look at the other 2 remains because of Josiah's demeanor, which included a tiny quiver in his voice and the way his eyes avoided direct contact. The explanation appeared reasonable enough. The second was the body of Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old farmer in good health who had reportedly had a heart attack while tending to his fields. Even more unsettling was discovered during Dr. Harrison's examination. Webb had tiny puncture wounds on his arms and chest that were too carefully placed to be coincidental. Ezekiel Hartwell, when asked to explain, said that Webb had collapsed and landed on some farming implements. However, the wounds were too well defined and intentional for such a chance incident. The most damaging evidence came from the third body. After a brief illness, Mary Patterson, a 6-year-old mother of 2, was said to have died of a fever. But around her mouth and fingernails, Dr. Harrison found signs of a white powder residue. The material was instantly identified by his medical background as arsenic, a toxin that was regrettably widespread in rural regions where it was employed to manage rodent populations. Dr. Harrison became conscious of a repressive environment within the Hartwell institution as he published his findings. With a frigid watchfulness in place of their previous warmth, the family members exchanged significant glances. In the doorway, with a look that could only be characterized as predatory, was Martha Hartwell, who had been in the kitchen making tea. Even Rebecca, who had appeared so naive, observed the events with eyes that were far more knowledgeable than her years. Dr. Harrison pushed on a closer inspection of the basement preparation room, which turned up more unsettling information. Numerous sizable glass containers with a variety of chemical solutions, some of which seemed to contain preserved human parts for unidentified uses, were arranged along one wall. In response to questions concerning these specimens, Ezekiel stated that they were used for teaching to gain a better understanding of the illnesses that killed their clients. Nonetheless, the organs looked new, and several had undergone precise surgical sectioning that didn't seem essential for straightforward storage. The most disturbing of these was a leather-bound notebook that Dr. Harrison found half-buried under a pile of burial garments. Caleb Hartwell swiftly rushed to block his view before he could take a closer look, claiming it contained confidential family documents. Dr. Harrison did, however, catch a fleeting glance of what seemed to be thorough notes about different members of the community, including details about their financial situation, familial situation, and health. By the time the examination was over, Dr. Harrison was in a tight spot. According to his medical background, there were indications of foul play in at least 3 of the recent deaths. However, the neighborhood revered the Hartwell family, and his proof was circumstantial. Furthermore, the local authorities, who had known and trusted the Hartwells for more than 20 years, would be skeptical of his charges because he was an outsider doing a routine check. Several residents of the community who had heard about Dr. Harrison's visit to the funeral parlor approached him that evening at the Millbrook Inn as he was preparing his preliminary report. He was completely chilled by the pattern that emerged in their chats. They spoke about the unusually high number of recent deaths, and how the Hartwell family reacted almost eagerly when they learned of someone's deteriorating condition. Sarah Peaton gave a particularly unsettling story. 2 weeks prior, her elderly mother had passed away. Sarah revealed that prior to Martha Hartwell's frequent visits, when she brought homemade soup and provided consolation during a mild episode of joint discomfort, her mother had been in good health and spirits. The elderly woman became seriously ill within 3 days of these visits and passed away before a doctor could be called. Out of seeming kindness, the Hartwell family had given their services right away, waiving their regular price. Though earlier warnings had been disregarded or forgotten by a community that trusted them, Dr. Harrison's unsettling findings in Millbrook were not the first time suspicions had been raised about the Hartwell family's actions. As he learned more about the family's past, a pattern of unexplained deaths that started more than 20 years ago when they first arrived in Pennsylvania started to surface. Ezekiel had learnt the funeral trade from an uncle in Richmond, according to the Hartwells, who had moved to Millbrook from Western Virginia in 1801. They had paid in gold coins, which appeared extraordinarily plentiful for a family professing humble means, to acquire their property from the estate of a recently deceased landowner. Local records at the time indicated that an outbreak of what was characterized as a wasting sickness had occurred during their first winter in Millbrook, resulting in the deaths of 8 people, all of whom were prepared for burial by the recently founded Hartwell Funeral Parlor. Over the years, residents of the town have sometimes commented on some oddities in deaths that involved the Hartwells. Afterwards, families would remark on how rapidly their loved ones appeared to deteriorate once the Hartwells started helping, how ready the family was to take care of all the arrangements, and how they discouraged delays in burial or second medical opinions. However, such observations were written off as the normal suspicions that occasionally follow bereavement in a close-knit community where the Hartwells had demonstrated their generosity and compassion. There were secrets in the Hartwell establishment's basement that, if they had been found, would have appalled the neighborhood. The family kept what could only be called a laboratory of death behind a false wall that Dr. Harrison had missed during his inspection. Shelves stocked with different poisons, surgical tools far more advanced than any funeral preparation would need, and intricate anatomical drawings that alluded to experiments that went well beyond the basic care of the dead. The full version of the journal that Dr. Harrison had seen was the most incriminating of all. Each person who had passed away while under their care was meticulously documented in this leather-bound book, which also included in-depth notes regarding the efficacy of different treatments and medications. Written by several people over a long period of time, the notes demonstrated a methodical approach to murder that had been honed via meticulous observation and practice. The journal recorded not only the killing techniques, but also the meticulous victim selection. The Hartwells were able to identify people whose deaths would be lamented but not thoroughly examined because they had a deep awareness of their community. Preferred targets included elderly people with few family members, people with pre-existing medical conditions, and people who had fallen on hard times. Additionally, the family had mastered the art of spacing out their activities such that no pattern would be readily apparent to the untrained eye. Written in Josiah's meticulous script, one particularly unsettling piece detailed Marcus Webb's murder in clinical detail. Webb had been chosen because he was a widower with no close relatives, and because it was easy to get rid of evidence because his farm was adjacent to the Hartwell property. According to the Post, Webb had been tricked into going to the funeral parlor to talk about buying a coffin for a neighbor who had lately passed away. After being overpowered and put through what the journal euphemistically called experimental procedures, after he arrived, he was killed, and his body was arranged to look like he had suffered a heart attack. Financial gain, psychological fulfillment, and what could only be defined as scientific curiosity about death and dying seemed to be the family's multifaceted reason. They frequently stole money and belongings from their victims, although this seemed to be less important to them than their apparent interest in the act of causing and witnessing death. Numerous diary entries detailed their attempts to perfect techniques that would leave no overt signs of foul play, their experimentation with various poisons, and their observations of how different people responded to pain and fear. The journal entries revealed Martha Hartwell to be the family's most crafty member. Her specialty was making friends with lonely or weak individuals of the community and earning their trust over time before adding poisons to the meals or beverages she made for them. She was the ideal predator because of her matronly look and reputation for kindness, which allowed her to approach possible victims without raising red flags. As they grew older, the kids were progressively incorporated into the family's activities. Despite her childhood and innocent look, Rebecca had developed the ability to spot possible victims at social events and would tell her family about people who appeared to be lonely, unwell, or struggling financially. By learning how to subdue victims and fabricate crime scenes to evade detection, both sons had become proficient in the physical aspects of murder. Their incorporation into the social fiber of the village was what gave the Hartwell operation its especially ominous feel. They kept relations with many of the same individuals they were methodically killing, attended church services, and took part in town meetings. A degree of psychological compartmentalization was necessary for this dual existence, which implied either innate psychopathy or a slow spiral into lunacy that had engulfed the whole family. Their actions had increased in the fall of 1823 due to a combination of opportunity and increasing self-assurance. Many families were in financial trouble after the hard winter, making them open to the Hartwells' offers of help. At the same time, the family had become more daring due to their success in evading detection, which resulted in the accelerated timeline that had eventually caught Dr. Harrison's attention. Dr. Harrison had to make a decision that would put his courage and professional ethics to the test. Clear proof of foul play had been found throughout his medical evaluation. However, he would have to accuse a well-respected family of systematic murder in order to report his findings to the local authorities, an accusation that would sound absurd to a community that had put its trust in the Hartwells for more than 20 years. Furthermore, postponing his departure would necessitate explanations that Dr. Harrison was ill-prepared to provide, as he was due to continue his inspection tour to other townships in a few days. The answer was found in an unexpected place. Martha Hartwell's old father, Thomas Creed, approached Dr. Harrison on his second night in Millbrook and asked for a private medical consultation. The elderly guy requested that Dr. Harrison check him outside of the funeral home because he was experiencing excruciating stomach pains. Creed's manner instantly changed from that of a weak patient to something far more cunning when they met in the stable behind the inn. "I know what you found during your examination today, Doctor," Creed whispered, his eyes darting anxiously toward the street. "You're right to be suspicious, but you don't fully comprehend what's happening in that house. The marks, the poison, and the wounds that don't match the claimed causes of death." Over the course of the following hour, Thomas Creed presented Dr. Harrison with a picture of evil that went beyond even the doctor's developing misgivings. Over the course of several months, Creed stated, he had been gradually poisoned by his own family, exhibiting the exact symptoms that had accompanied the deaths of a number of recent victims. He had been the perfect test subject for the family's trials due to his senior age and deteriorating health, but he was able to recognize and thwart their attempts to kill him thanks to his survival instinct and understanding of their strategies. Creed claimed that the family's operations had started off as straightforward grave robbing. Ezekiel had learned shortly after they had arrived in Millbrook that recently interred dead might be dug up and stripped of priceless jewels, gold teeth, and burial garments that could be sold in far-off towns. As the family discovered that they could boost their earnings by producing their own supply of bodies, this initial illicit enterprise had progressively transformed into something much more terrible. The pivotal moment occurred in 1807 when the family was trying to rob a seriously ill man and unintentionally killed him. Instead of being exposed, they had concealed the murder and found that the community accepted their victim's death as a normal part of his sickness. Each member of the family had acquired specific skills and duties in their growing business as a result of this success, which had led to increasingly daring murder experiments. According to Creed, the laboratory in the basement held comprehensive records of more than 40 homicides that had been carried out in the previous 16 years, with victims meticulously chosen from all around the area to evade suspicion. The family had established a network of connections in nearby towns who would notify them of possible targets, such as lone travelers, secluded people, or anyone whose disappearance might not be looked into right away. Creed's close familiarity with the family's tactics and his ability to supply specific information on recent victims that Dr. Harrison had inspected gave his testimony a unique level of credibility. He explained in detail how Mary Patterson had been poisoned over a period of weeks as Martha feigned to nurse her through a made-up illness, how Marcus Webb had been tortured before his murder, and how Elianena Fairchild had been strangled. The elderly guy also disclosed that the Hartwell family had buried victims whose remains couldn't be explained as natural deaths in a mass grave tucked away in the woods behind the Hartwell estate. The remains of at least a dozen people were buried here, including a number of travelers who had stopped at the funeral house for instructions or refuge and were never seen again. Creed had both pragmatic and personal reasons for betraying his family. He had become more and more appalled at what they were doing. But more significantly, he had come to the realization that he was going to die soon. His family had grown weary of helping him, and recent discussions had indicated that his time as a test subject was running out. Exposing their crimes and requesting protection from authorities was his only chance of survival. The elderly guy suggested a strategy that would shield them both from immediate reprisals while enabling Dr. Harrison to obtain indisputable proof. When the family was away at Sunday church services, Creed would give the doctor the key to the laboratory in the basement so he could look at the secret documents and proof. While Creed would take advantage of the same occasion to flee to the house of a distant relative in Philadelphia, Harrison would receive the documentation he needed to persuade authorities. The rest of the night was spent by Dr. Harrison considering the ramifications of Creed's disclosures. With scores of killings carried out over almost 20 years, by a family that had been revered and trusted by their whole neighborhood, the extent of the crimes was astounding. The faith and security of hundreds of innocent individuals who had thought they were protected in their small community would be destroyed, but the evidence Creed promised would probably be enough to get convictions. The fact that Dr. Harrison himself was now under danger was much more concerning. The family's suspicions had been sparked by his inspection of the remains, and his continuing stay in Millbrook posed a risk to their operation. Creed cautioned that the family has previously killed to keep their secrets safe and would not think twice about doing so if they were in a tight spot. They came up with a plan that required a great deal of daring and exact timing. Before the family knew what had happened, Dr. Harrison would have to enter the basement laboratory, record the evidence he discovered there, and leave Millbrook. At the same time, Creed would vanish, appearing to have just lost his way in his senile confusion, absence that would be tragic, but not instantly alarming. As the people of Millbrook got ready for their weekly church services, Sunday morning was gloomy and chilly, with a November chill that seemed to pierce their very bones. During the restless night at the inn, Dr. Harrison had alternately gone over his medical records and questioned the rationality of the strategy he had committed to. The thought that his own life now was on the line added to the physical and mental weight of the possible evidence concealed in the Hartwell basement. He had received thorough instructions from Thomas Creed on how to enter the laboratory in the basement while the family was away at church. Being well-known Methodists, the Hartwells were always present at Sunday services and usually stayed for social events that went far into the afternoon. This would give Dr. Harrison about 3 hours to find and record the evidence Creed had mentioned. Creed had handed him a small, elaborate key that opened a secret compartment behind the stone wall of the basement. The elderly man claimed that in addition to the full murder journal, this compartment included preserved specimens, poison supplies, and intricate anatomical drawings that would unquestionably prove the family's criminal activity. More significantly, it included a thorough map that indicated the site of the secret graveyard where scores of victims had been interred throughout the years. Dr. Harrison stood in the woods behind the Hartwell property as the church bells rang out over Millbrook, and he saw the family leave their house in their Sunday best. Martha had opted for a dark blue dress with a white collar that highlighted her matronly respectability, while Ezekiel donned a black suit that gave him a solemn ministerial appearance. While Rebecca strolled modestly next to her mother, her innocent demeanor concealing the cunning intellect Creed had described, Josiah and Caleb flanked their parents, appearing to be the loyal sons. The family's seemingly normal demeanor as they made their way to the chapel was what disturbed Dr. Harrison the most. They had killed dozens of innocent individuals over the last 20 years, yet their faces bore no sign of the horror Creed had spoken about. They smiled at kids playing in yards, chatted with neighbors along the route, and portrayed themselves as the epitome of family values and Christian goodness. The doctor didn't approach the funeral home until 30 minutes after the family had left. In the feeble fall sunlight, the building stood majestic and silent, its stone walls concealing secrets that, if discovered, would shock the entire community. As he entered through the basement door with Thomas Creed's key, Dr. Harrison's hands shook a little, but he forced himself to go slowly because his medical training had equipped him for dealing with unsettling facts. At first, the basement looked just as he had seen it during his formal inspection. Tidy, well-kept, and orderly. The few bodies in their care now rested quietly beneath white sheets. The embalming tables were immaculate, and the chemical solutions were appropriately labeled and kept. Dr. Harrison didn't see the hidden door Creed had mentioned until he started looking more closely at the walls. The little key unlocked a concealed panel behind a portion of stone wall that looked exactly like the rest of the basement, revealing a room of horrors beyond his wildest dreams. The secret area stretched beneath the whole home footprint and into the hillside beyond, and it was bigger than the ordinary basement. The walls were lined with shelves that held hundreds of glass jars of preserved human organs, each meticulously labeled with dates and what seemed like experimental numbers. On a wooden lectern in the middle of the room, the murder notebook held a prominent position. Years' worth of entries, written by several different people but with constant attention to detail, filled the leather-bound volume, which spoke of the application of scientific methodology to the act of murder. Although Dr. Harrison's medical background enabled him to comprehend the technical details of what he was reading, the family's clinical accuracy in documenting their crimes was possibly even more horrible than the actual killings. The format of each record was the same: the victim's name, the approach method, the killing technique, the victim's reactions noted, and notes for future use. From straightforward poisonings to more complex techniques that indicated years of skill and improvement, the entries showed a continuum. Experiments with different surgical techniques were displayed in recent postings. These were reportedly carried out on live patients to examine their effects. The realization that the family's activities went well beyond Millbrook was what startled Dr. Harrison the most. The murders were recorded in the notebook in at least 6 separate Pennsylvania townships, and the victims were chosen while the family was traveling to conduct funerals for clients who lived far away. They had established a method for locating weaker members of each group, and they frequently returned months later to carry out crimes in less suspect locations. Even more unsettling than the journal entries were the anatomical sketches. The development of several experimental procedures was depicted in detail, along with meticulous notes regarding which approaches caused the greatest dread in the victims and which worked best for particular personality types. According to the drawings, the family approached murder with the same systematic precision that respectable academics might use with animal specimens, viewing their victims not as human beings, but as objects for scientific study. Dr. Harrison was still investigating the secret room when he heard voices outside the structure. With increasing worry, he looked at his pocket watch and saw that he had been in the basement for more than 2 hours, recording the evidence he had found. The family was returning from church far earlier than they had been supposed to, and he could hear the unique rhythm of Ezekiel Hartwell speaking as the voices became louder. Dr. Harrison became aware of his hazardous position and panicked. Damning evidence of the family's crimes was confined in the secret chamber, and if they found him, they would undoubtedly kill him. He heard footsteps on the wooden porch over his head as the voices approached the structure. Staying hidden in the chamber would merely postpone his discovery until they arrived to inquire about their secrets, even if his escape route through the basement entrance would put him right in their path. The scenario takes a tragic turn just when we were beginning to believe that Dr. Harrison's investigation could reveal the terrible truth about the Hartwell family. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Please click the like button to show your support for our work, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's find out what occurs in this horror house next. Desperate to find another way out, Dr. Harrison discovered that the secret chamber was longer than he had first thought. Another entrance, partially hidden under stacks of glass specimen jars at the far end of the room, seemed to lead farther into the hillside. He was forced to take the chance of investigating this uncharted path in the hopes that it would lead to escape rather than a deeper dive into the nightmare he had discovered. As the voices of the family were getting closer and closer, Dr. Harrison entered a hand-carved tunnel that stretched deep into the slope behind the Hartwell property, which was a narrow corridor behind the specimen chamber. The walls were made of rough stone that had been gradually expanded over years, carved with crude tools. The doctor started to see the full extent of the Hartwell family's enterprise as he made his way through the tunnel using a candle he had discovered in the chamber. The tunnel led to a naturally occurring cave that had been transformed into what was essentially a charnel house. The remains of people were strewn all over the cavern, some neatly placed on stone shelves and others merely heaped in corners where they had been thrown away in a hurry. There was an overpowering stench of decay and death. Despite his terror, Dr. Harrison was able to analyze the scene with professional objectivity because of his medical background. The full scope of the family's crimes was exposed by what he found in that underground cemetery. Decades of systematic murder were represented by the presence of at least 40 people's remains in varying levels of decay. While some of the victims appeared to have been murdered fast and effectively, others displayed indications of the experimental treatments described in the journal. Coins, clothing, and jewelry found among the corpses were personal items that indicated robbery had been a major driving force behind many of the killings. The area of the cave where recent victims had been exhibited, resembling trophies, was the most unsettling. Dr. Harrison verified that the Hartwells had been methodically killing their clients rather than merely preparing natural deaths for burial by identifying clothing and jewelry belonging to a number of people he had inspected during his official inspection. These remains' clinical arrangement indicated that the family frequently visited this basement vault, possibly to continue their gruesome experiments or to relive their murders. Dr. Harrison heard voices coming from the tunnel behind him while he recorded what he had discovered in the cave. After learning of his disappearance from the inn, the Hartwells reportedly uncovered proof that he had broken into their private room. His name was called by several voices, but none of them were worried. It was the sound of hunters chasing cornered prey with patience and predatory intentness. Dr. Harrison was able to escape through a small opening that went to the forested slope above the Hartwell property, demonstrating that the cave system had several exits. He was able to observe the family exploring the neighborhood around their house with the methodical efficiency of those who had previously carried out such searches. They combed the region methodically, indicating that prior investigators had not survived their discoveries, and it became evident that Dr. Harrison was not the first to learn their secrets. It took a great deal of luck and all of the doctor's outdoor survival skills to get out of Millbrook. In order to avoid highways where the Hartwells may follow him, he was compelled to leave his possessions in the inn and go cross-country toward the closest significant town. He needed to travel to civilized regions before the family could completely quiet him, but his medical bag had enough evidence to persuade authorities. Dr. Harrison was unaware that Thomas Creed had not made his planned escape. The elderly man's relatives questioned him about his treachery after they found him trying to leave the residence. Creed had told everything about his agreement with Dr. Harrison while being tortured, including the doctor's intentions to record their crimes and report them to the police. The family had decided to start looking for Dr. Harrison after returning early from church because of this revelation. Worse, it had persuaded them that their Millbrook enterprise could no longer be sustained. Instead of just getting rid of Dr. Harrison and carrying on, they had made the decision to leave their current base and move to a new town where they could start over. As meticulously planned as their crimes had been, so too was the Hartwells' departure from Millbrook. Ezekiel had gotten an urgent message about a dying relative in Ohio, they said, and the trip had to be made immediately, possibly keeping them away for several months. They asked neighbors to watch over their property while they were away, as the funeral home would be temporarily shuttered. The majority of the community believed that this was a legitimate family situation that needed their help and compassion. The Hartwells were deliberately removing proof of their misdeeds before they left, but the villagers were unaware of this. They emptied and shut the secret compartment. All written records of their actions were either burned or packed for transportation to their new site, and the cave system was partially collapsed to conceal the remains it held. 3 days after Dr. Harrison arrived in Philadelphia, the Hartwell family had totally disappeared, leaving behind nothing but an empty funeral house and a population that would never guess the atrocities that had taken place among them. Authorities in Philadelphia were skeptical of what Dr. Harrison had found, believing it was impossible for a well-respected family to have committed such widespread crimes without being caught. By the time detectives got to Millbrook, most of the doctor's strong evidence had been buried or destroyed. The extent of Dr. Harrison's charges could not be supported by the few remains they were able to retrieve from the partially collapsed cave system. The community's reluctance to accept such horrific allegations against the Hartwell family hindered the subsequent investigation. Character references for the Hartwells were given by the town's residents, who insisted that they had been kind, giving neighbors who were incapable of committing the crimes Dr. Harrison detailed. Authorities were compelled to come to the conclusion that, although suspicious conditions existed, there was not enough evidence to support a big manhunt because the family was not present to be questioned, and the most of the physical evidence had been destroyed. The family attributed Thomas Creed's disappearance to the wanderings of an elderly man who had lost his way in the woods and became bewildered. Although search teams were unable to locate him, and his fate was not yet known, Dr. Harrison was certain that Creed had paid the ultimate price for trying to reveal his family's wrongdoing. For years to come, Dr. Harrison and the people of Millbrook were plagued by the fallout from his discoveries. Although the doctor provided thorough reports to state officials, the case was ultimately deemed inconclusive and tucked away in the expanding Pennsylvania state government bureaucracy, since the Hartwell family was not there to answer questions, and the majority of the physical evidence had been destroyed. Dr. Harrison never lost faith in what he had seen, and he invested a great deal of his own money in trying to find the Hartwells. Similar disappearances and strange deaths occurred in a number of Ohio communities between 1824 and 1825, according to his findings. However, the family had disappeared once more before he could notify the police in those places. Dr. Harrison recorded similar trends in Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory over the course of the next 10 years, but he was never able to stop more killings or apprehend the killers. The residents of Millbrook were left to consider the prospect that they had spent more than 20 years in the company of systematic killers. The Hartwells had been excellent neighbors who were being wrongfully accused, according to some locals who did not accept Dr. Harrison's story. Others started to re-examine previous deaths with fresh mistrust, questioning how many of their friends and family members had been murdered as opposed to being attributed to natural causes. A Philadelphia entrepreneur bought the Hartwell Funeral Parlor building and turned it into a general shop after it had been vacant for almost 2 years. It took years for the community to completely embrace the building's new purpose because locals were hesitant to enter. No one was interested in exploring the subterranean system described by Dr. Doc Harrison, and the basement was sealed up for good. Most tragically, Millbrook's character was radically altered by the distrust and terror engendered by the Hartwell affair. Weariness and uncertainty took the place of the openness and trust that had characterized the community for generations. The neighbors started to look at one another suspiciously. Instead of being accepted, death started to inspire terror. Additionally, the basic religion that had united the community was irreversibly shattered. Even though Dr. Harrison was still a traveling doctor, what he had seen in Millbrook had a lasting impact on him. During his inspections, he became nearly compulsive about details, looking into every death with the thoroughness of a criminal detective instead of a regular health official. His co-workers started to think he was strange, even suspicious. However, Dr. Harrison was aware that even the most honorable facades may conceal evil. Nearly 24 years after his Millbrook ordeal, Dr. Harrison received a letter in 1847 that would confirm his long-held convictions and add a terrifying conclusion to the Hartwell tale. In Oregon Territory, where westward migration had brought thousands of people looking for new prospects in the extreme regions of the American frontier, a sheriff sent the letter. A family named Caldwell had run a funeral home in a small Oregon town for 3 years before being exposed under circumstances strikingly identical to those Dr. Harrison had found in Pennsylvania, according to the sheriff's account. The sheriff recognized the same patterns of unexplained killings, methodical poisoning, and secret burial locations from reading Dr. Harrison's prior findings in federal archives. Authorities discovered evidence of at least 30 murders over their 3 years in Oregon when they eventually stormed the Caldwell operation. More importantly, they found evidence that the Caldwells were, in fact, the Hartwell family, who had been migrating westward across America for more than 20 years, taking on new names and carrying out their homicidal activities in every new town. After being apprehended alive, the family confessed to crimes that had occurred in 8 different states over a period of over 30 years. They were one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, having killed over 120 people in total. Despite being 73 years old, Ezekiel Hartwell, now known as Ezekiel Caldwell, remained cognitively sharp and exhibited no remorse for his misdeeds. Rebecca, Josiah, Caleb, and Martha had all remained involved in the family business, honing their skills and broadening their approaches with every move. The family's confessions put an end to dozens of unresolved disappearances around the frontier and exposed the full extent of their misdeeds. They went into great detail about how they had refined their methods for choosing victims, building trust in new areas, and getting rid of evidence. Worst of all, they took satisfaction in their achievements, considering themselves prosperous business people who had only picked a niche. In December 1847, Ezekiel Hartwell, his wife Martha, and son Josiah were hanged in Salem, Oregon. After being given a life sentence, Caleb passed away from pneumonia in 1852. Rebecca, who claimed to have been forced by her family while still quite young, was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but passed away in 1851 from unspecified circumstances. Communities across America where the Hartwell family had operated were rocked by the disclosure of the full extent of their misdeeds. Families who had confided in them during their most vulnerable times came to the realization that they had been around cunning killers. The case turned into a warning on the perils of blindly trusting strangers, regardless of how reputable they may seem. Now in his 70s, Dr. Harrison journeyed to Oregon to see Ezekiel Hartwell executed and to face the man who had been on his mind for more than 20 years. Hartwell was surprised that Dr. Harrison had survived his discoveries in Millbrook, saying that a number of other investigators over the years had not been as lucky. The two men met briefly prior to the execution. During their last discussion, Hartwell disclosed one additional unsettling fact. The family had taught their techniques to others, apprentices who had set up shop in different regions of the growing country. He said that similar activities were being carried out by at least 3 other families, but he would not divulge any information that could lead police to them. Dr. Harrison's remaining years would be spent knowing that the evil he had found in Millbrook was now sweeping over America, thanks to this revelation. When it was discovered that their dependable neighbors had committed systematic murder, the Millbrook neighborhood never entirely recovered. As families left the town because they could no longer handle the burden of their common past, it slowly began to deteriorate. Millbrook was completely deserted by 1860, and the structures where so much evil had been concealed started to be reclaimed by the forest. The crimes committed by the Hartwell family are now mostly forgotten. Government archives buried the official reports. The communities they terrified attempted to obliterate any recollection of them, and the newspaper articles were forgotten. The Hartwell case, however, is a reminder to those who study the darker periods of American history that evil may thrive anywhere, concealed beneath facades of respectability and shielded by the very innocence and trust it aims to undermine. In a time before contemporary communication and law enforcement coordination, serial killers could act with impunity, as the Hartwell funeral parlor case illustrates. It demonstrates how predators may take advantage of the innate human trust that united societies and use that trust as a weapon against their prey. Most significantly, it shows how common people, physicians, neighbors, and family members had the ability to reveal major sins on occasion, but only if they were prepared to see past outward manifestations and follow their instincts. In the hope that his records will one day assist future detectives in identifying comparable crime patterns, Dr. Harrison spent his last years recording what he had discovered about the Hartwell case. He passed away in 1853, bringing with him first-hand knowledge of one of the most heinous family-run criminal operations in America. After being uncovered among his documents, his meticulous notes finally made their way into federal archives, where they now stand as evidence of crimes that even the detectives who uncovered were astounded by. Beyond their direct victims, the Hartwell family's legacy includes the profound transformations they wrought in each community they came into contact with. They replaced trust with distrust and innocence with fatigue, destroying the sense of security that had made tiny towns work like extended families. In this sense, their influence on American culture went much beyond the people they killed, affecting the fundamental fabric of local life in the growing country. This mystery demonstrates how readily evil can pass for respectability, and how our worst nightmares can occasionally be housed in the very institutions we rely on to provide us with solace in our darkest moments. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think the crimes committed by the Hartwell family were fully exposed? Or perhaps even more sinister secrets perished along with them? If you have heard similar tales from the past of your own area, please share them with us in the comments section below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell someone you love dark mysteries if you liked this story and would like to see more historical horror stories like it. We'll keep delving into the numerous mysteries of the past together. I'll see you in the upcoming video.